I'm Mike McDermott, an old retired soldier, and this is video number 36 in the series that I intend to complete concerning all of the campaigns, the 192 campaigns fought by the American Army. In this particular video, we're going to cover the first two campaigns of the Indian Wars. The first one, of course, was fought during Washington's administration, 1790, and it was a campaign fought against the Miami Indians in what subsequently became known as the Old Northwest, which is that area west of the Appalachian Mountains, north of the Ohio River, and up to the Great Lakes. Known as the Northwest Indian War, the Ohio War, or Little Turtles War, the Miami campaign was the first of a series of military efforts conducted by the United States Army against Indian tribes that persisted on, that is, the Indian Wars persisted on for 100 years, culminating in 1890, which was the last fight between the Sioux Indians and the U.S. Army, at that time, the state of South Dakota. This first campaign focused on a confederation of British-supported Indian tribes who were fighting to maintain control of territory that the British had ceded to the United States in 1783 as part of the Treaty of Paris. Although the treaty brought an end to the American Revolution, the numerous Indian tribes residing in that region were not a party to the agreement, and they refused to recognize United States claims to land north of the Ohio River. Despite treaty requirements, the British also continued to occupy some of their forts south of the Great Lakes, where they traded with and encouraged Indians to resist the Americans. They were buying furs and trading rifles and ammunition and encouraging those Indians to attack American settlers. In 1787, the Continental Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, creating the Northwest Territory and establishing the groundwork for creating new states in that region. The ordinance also served to perpetuate conflict on the frontier by encouraging settlement north of the Ohio River into lands that were claimed by the Indians. Tensions were continuous, and violent confrontations between settlers and the approximately 45,000 Indians in the region were routine. Several Indian leaders, including a man named Little Turtle, refused to recognize the validity of any claims made by the encroaching American settlers. Renewing a confederation of Indian tribes previously organized during the American Revolution, warrior societies from the Miami, Delaware, Huron, Shawnee, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, and Overmountain Cherokee tribes increased their raids on settlements and homesteads both north and south of the Ohio River. Between 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, and 1790, when President George Washington ordered the United States Army to campaign against those tribes, the Indians killed or took prisoner about 1,500 men, women, and children. Despite the ongoing danger, settlers continued to move into the Northwest Territory, and in August of 1790, the president ordered a punitive expedition to attack the Indians along the Wabash and Illinois rivers. It's important to remember that then President Washington had a history as an Indian fighter himself. Years earlier, during the opening days of the French and Indian War, Washington, of course, was an officer commissioned by the colony of Virginia, serving with the British Army and with General Braddock when that force was ambushed and largely destroyed. Braddock was killed. Washington was able to escape with others at a location which is now in the state of Pennsylvania. By October 1790, General Joshua Harmer had a force of 1,453 men assembled near the present-day town of Fort Wayne, Indiana. On the 19th of October, he was drawn into a fight with Little Turtle's warriors, and in a 2-day battle, 82 Americans were killed. On the third day, 130 more men were killed and 94 were wounded in a lopsided action the Indians called the Battle of the Pumpkin Fields, because the scalped skulls of the Americans reminded them of squash steaming in the autumn air. Thoroughly discouraged, General Harmer withdrew his survivors with little to show for their efforts, and the Indians were encouraged by their success and attacked settlements all across that region. The next year, Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory, was commissioned a major general in order to launch a campaign to punish the Indians. He had trouble recruiting, and his men received little training before they took the field late in 1791. Encamped near the headwaters of the Wabash River in Ohio, their poorly prepared defenses were overrun at dawn on the 4th of November by about 2,000 warriors, again led by Little Turtle. 632 of the 920 soldiers and officers were killed, and many of those survivors were wounded while they did manage to escape. Nearly all of the 200 wives, children, and other camp followers described as laundresses, however, were slaughtered by the Indians. A total of 832 Americans died that day, the highest number of any battle during the Indian Wars. The news shocked the public, and President Washington flew into what one observer called a fit of passion when he read General St. Clair's report. Following General St. Clair's defeat, a militiaman who escaped during the confusion described what he had seen, and he wrote, "In the frenzy of victory, the Indians inflicted on the luckless captives every species of cruelty that savage ingenuity could devise. They danced and laughed and howled at the screams of prisoners roasting at the stake. They pulled out men's intestines bit by bit and flayed others alive and slowly hacked or wrenched their arms away. They dashed out the brains of children against the trunks of trees and flung their battered bodies into the brush. Some of the women were raped and then stretched naked on the ground and run through with wooden stakes." Attacks on settlers and travelers and military outposts continued unabated during the next year, and in October of 1792, a Grand Council of Indian leaders decided the Ohio River should remain the boundary for American expansion. That was that confederation of Indian tribes who came together and agreed on formally insisting that the Ohio River was the boundary, despite the earlier treaty with the British. Indian representatives and Secretary of War Henry Knox's commissioners met on the 31st of July, 1793, but angry demands and mutual arguments ensured no peace treaty would be signed at that point. General Anthony Wayne was the commander of the Legion of the United States, as the nation's army was then called, and was engaged in conducting a rigorous basic training for its soldiers. His organized instruction was the first standardized introduction to soldiering in the history of the United States Army. Learning that negotiations with the Indians had failed, General Wayne left his training camp at Cincinnati and moved north, building a series of forts as he advanced. In November 1793, he constructed Fort Greenville on the Miami River and put his 3,000 men into winter quarters. At the end of the year, a detachment was sent to the site of General St. Clair's debacle to construct defensive works named Fort Recovery. In June of 1794, the troops improved Fort Recovery and a month later defeated an attack by 1,200 warriors who were accompanied by British officers. Joined by 1,400 mounted militia, General Wayne then marched his force deeper into territory that was controlled by the Indians. On 20 August, he attacked and defeated 1,500 Indians plus a British company of Canadian militia at a location called Fallen Timbers near present-day Toledo, Ohio. The Indians had taken up a defensive position, and after an initial volley of rifle fire, the Americans charged with the bayonet, and the Indians began retreating. The mounted American militia then caught the Indians in the open, and the fight became a chase. The troops spent several days destroying nearby villages and about 5,000 acres of crops before they departed. General Wayne lost 33 men killed and had about 100 men wounded, while Indian dead on the field numbered fewer than 50. Although 6 white men who were members of that Canadian militia company, commanded by a British lieutenant colonel named William Caldwell, were killed. General Wayne had administered a severe blow to the Indians, and news of the victory had far-reaching implications as it helped John Jay negotiate a treaty with the British that required them to abandon their forts in the Northwest Territory. It actually reaffirmed what had previously been agreed at the end of the American Revolutionary War. President Washington had an extensive experience with Indians, as I mentioned during the introduction, which started during the French and Indian Wars, when initially he led a combined force of Virginia militia and Seneca Indians against the French in Ohio. That expedition ended when he attacked a French camp, killing 10 and taking 21 prisoners. The following year, he was serving as a volunteer officer, that is, commissioned by the colony of Virginia, with British General Braddock's army when it was defeated by French and Indians. As president, he was quoted as saying, "The basis of our proceedings with the Indian nations has been and shall be justice," end quote. Regardless of how justice might be described or dispensed, President Washington's policy toward the Indians was clearly subordinate to achieving national sovereignty over the Northwest Territory. After Little Turtle's defeat at Fallen Timbers, a new Indian leader made his presence felt in the villages. Even though the Treaty of Greenville limited lands open to settlement, many Indians feared continued American encroachment, and a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh became the main spokesman for pan-tribal resistance to the Americans. A spellbinding speaker who visited tribes from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, he intended to bring together the Indians of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys in the most ambitious confederacy of Indian tribes ever attempted by an Indian leader. In 1811, it was clear to him that a renewed conflict between the British and their former colonies was imminent, and his message became more strident. The land belonged to all Indians, and the Americans should be pushed back to the Hudson River so the lost lands could be recovered and shared by all Indians in common. Traveling widely and presenting his dream for an Indian confederacy to all who would listen, Tecumseh also expected British support, as a broadly based coalition blocking American expansion would be of mutual interest. While he traveled, his younger brother, a fanatical medicine man called the Prophet, remained at a large multi-tribal community near the Tippecanoe River. The Prophet's mission was to preach a virulent rejection of United States authority to a growing audience at the village, which became known as Prophet's Town. Meanwhile, the governor of the newly formed Indiana Territory, General William Henry Harrison, was increasingly concerned as tensions and violence grew. Although personally impressed with Tecumseh, he worked to undermine the message of Indian unity by negotiating a series of land treaties with individual tribes. After an early meeting with the Indian leader, General Harrison wrote, "The implicit obedience and respect which followers of Tecumseh pay him is really astonishing, and more than any other circumstance bespeaks him one of those uncommon geniuses who spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things, end quote. Tecumseh met with General Harrison several times, demanding the cancellation of recently signed treaties while offering an alliance if the lands were returned to their previous Indian owners, but to no avail. During an 1810 meeting, Tecumseh assured General Harrison he would seek assistance from the British if war started, while failing to mention that the British had already begun supplying arms and ammunition to several tribes, including the Shawnee. Following an outbreak the following year, and learning that Tecumseh was on a journey to enlist support from tribes in the South, General Harrison decided to intimidate the Shawnee by threatening the village at Tippecanoe. Commanding more than 1,000 men, which included 250 regular army soldiers, 170 mounted riflemen, and over 600 Indiana and Kentucky militia, the general marched out of Vincennes on the 26th of September, 1811. The troops arrived at Prophetstown on the 6th of November and were met by one of the prophet's followers who asked for a conference the following day. General Harrison agreed and moved his troops onto a nearby hill while posting sentries. Indians later reported the prophet was in a frenzy of mystical excitement, assuring the warriors in the village that he had cast a spell, turning the Americans' gunpowder into sand so their bullets could do no harm. When his followers' enthusiasm reached fever pitch, he selected 100 men for a special war party to enter the American camp and kill the general. The prophet swore their success would cause the American army to immediately fall apart. The Indians assaulted at first light, and while some Americans were killed in their tents, the troops succeeded in getting organized and into action. The plan to kill General Harrison failed, and he was soon riding through the camp, moving men to where they were most needed, while the prophet took his station on a nearby knoll, shrieking incantations designed to doom the Americans. After about 2 hours of tenacious fighting, marked by savage and frantic attacks and hand-to-hand combat, the initiative began to shift from the Indians to the Americans. General Harrison ordered counterattacks by the troops, and the Indians began a retreat that quickly became a race for their village. Once there, the prophet was harshly criticized for his failure to disarm the Americans, and despite fevered prayers, his authority was damaged beyond repair. Fearing a follow-on attack by the Indians, the Americans fortified their camp and did not approach the village until the following morning. Finding that the village was deserted, they burned the buildings before returning to the hilltop to bury the 62 soldiers who had been killed. Their 126 wounded were loaded into wagons for the return to Vincennes, a cold and a hungry march. Most of the militia were then released from duty and returned to their homes. When General Harrison informed the Secretary of War, William Estes, of a battle near the Tippecanoe River, he wrote that he feared an imminent reprisal from the Indians. And his comment was insightful, for while the battle dispersed those Indians occupying the prophet's town, it also precipitated an upsurge in attacks on settlers throughout the region and encouraged the tribes to support the British. A man named Isaac Naylor recalled the fight in the camp. He was a private in the militia. And he wrote, "I heard the crack of a rifle, followed by an awful Indian yell all around the encampment. At this moment, my friend Warnock was shot by a rifle ball through the body. He ran a few yards and fell dead to the ground. Our lines were broken and a few Indians were found on the inside of the encampment. In a few moments, they were all killed, and one Indian was killed in the back part of Captain Grieger's tent while he was attempting to tomahawk the captain. On the 16th of December, the first of the New Madrid earthquakes shook the entire region, and many Indians took the event as a sign of the prophet's predictions. They felt that doom was coming true. An upsurge in support for Tecumseh and an increase in attacks against settlers and isolated outposts resulted in the deaths of many American settlers. Once the War of 1812 started, the British commissioned Tecumseh a general in the British Army, and his Indian fighters made up nearly half of the force that captured Detroit in August of that year. The Indian leader was killed the following year at the Battle of the Thames, where American troops, commanded by General Harrison, brought an end to any dreams of an Indian confederacy which might threaten the American drive for manifest destiny. Although General Harrison received the thanks of Congress and a Congressional Gold Medal for his victory at the Battle of the Thames, it was the fight at Tippecanoe that he stressed during his successful bid for the presidency in 1840. General Harrison's attitude concerning America's western expansion was summed up thusly, and I quote, "Is one of the fairest portions of the globe to remain in a state of nature, the haunt of a few wretched savages, when it seems destined by the Creator to give support to a large population and to be the seat of our civilization," end quote. And so ended the second campaign of the American Army during the Indian Wars. Please don't hesitate to comment concerning the start of these campaigns. I look forward to reading what you have to say about this topic. And until then, God bless America.